Ladies and gentlemen, this is the 12th and final round.
Right hand, Golovkin steps in and down he goes again. Unbelievable. Mayweather makes him pay. What a rookie mistake. A sensational left hook by De La Hoya.
It's facts. I'm the best. You know what I mean? Sometimes I don't want to believe it myself, but it's the truth. I'm the best. I'm going to show you how great I am.
From Southern California, this is the Last Round Podcast.
Episode 110 of the Last Round Podcast. Thanks again, guys, for clicking on that button and listening, whether you downloaded it, you're streaming it on Boxing Socials, YouTube, on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple, wherever you're at, however you're listening. We appreciate it coming off of Friday, Saturday, big boxing weekend from Texas to Florida, UK involved, Mexico involved, Kazakhstan involved. Boxing is global. I think we've all said that in the past, and it definitely showed up this past weekend. But before we actually come into the fight reviews and previews of this past weekend and this upcoming week in the sport of boxing, we got a special guest in the building here on the Last Round. He's a former HBO producer, and he's a current on-air ringside reporter for Ring City USA on NBC Sports. And he's also the host of his own podcast, Ask the Experts podcast. Curran Bhatia joins us this week on the Last Round. Thanks for joining us, man.
Thank you guys so much for having me. It's an honor to be chatting with you. And you pronounced the name correctly, which is great. And I appreciate that.
Well, I mean, like I told you before, every time we get people on here, and they, sometimes they have a little bit of difficulty in their names, and how those general mistakes that people pronounce, we like to ask before we keep going. And luckily, yes. I asked you before we started recording this show.
And you nailed it, man. So thank you.
Yeah, we appreciate it. So before we kind of jump into obviously the Canelo, Triple G, Canelo-Smith, all the other events from this past weekend. Obviously, your newest gig is, like we were just talking about off the air, is with NBC Sports. And we were just talking about, the unique layout over here at the Wildcard Gym in Hollywood, California. Just for our listeners who obviously, who haven't heard from anybody on the inside, about the production and the experience. Can you kind of just talk to us about it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very innovative new series called Ring City USA. It's on NBC Sports Network. It's also on Twitch. For me, it's just an absolute honor. It's a dream come true. I love storytelling. I was able to do that for nearly a decade at HBO behind the camera as a producer director, and now on-air talent, and lucky enough to be working with Ring City and NBC Sports. And They took a chance on me, and it's been great just telling these stories so far. In terms of the layout and what we're doing, the first three shows in 2020 were at the Wildcard Boxing Club, of course, the legendary gym that Freddie Roach started 25 years ago, built the ring in the center by hand. And getting to see Freddie, talk to him, it's such an iconic gym. And there was times over the last three trips where I would just walk into that empty gym and just be like, I just can't believe I'm here. Just looking around at all the photos on the wall, and you think about all the fighters that have walked through that door, Manny Pacquiao, Miguel Cotto, and on and on and on. And being able to have that as the first venue, I think it just made it all that much more special. So it was a great run of three fights, and there'll be more fights for Ring City USA in 2021.
You said the Wildcard's the first venue. So are they going to kind of take it around different gyms around the US?
There's going to be other venues for sure for Ring City USA. But first three were at Wildcard. And then we shall see what 2021 has in store, but there's going to be definitely more Ring City USA shows, and there's going to be more on NBC Sports. So you're going to see a lot more of Ring City in 2021 for sure.
That's awesome. Yeah. And I know, obviously we know that a big reasoning behind having it outdoors because of the pandemic, especially in the state of California and in the Los Angeles County. But I think even if there was no pandemic, there was no COVID happening in this current world that we live in, I think having it outdoors in that wild card was such a unique environment. I think it'd be dumb not to use it again. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's the most iconic gym in the world, maybe one of them, right? Everyone knows what Freddie Roach has achieved and all the great fighters. So in terms of the outdoor, yeah, I mean, obviously, if you look at the pandemic, that changed everything that we're doing in boxing. It's crazy when you think back. On March 7th, I believe it was, I was at the Barclays Center for Adam Kovnowski's fight. And if you think about what a crazy thing that is to think about, that it was packed with 10,000 fans. And so now people have to get creative, try new things. And you could go into a conference hall the way that Top Rank and others have done and really make that look really cool. I've called it like kind of the nightclub look. If you look at the Top Rank bubble in Mexico City, I called it the red carpet look in terms of what they were doing there. And that was really cool too. But I think the great people at Ring City USA really thought outside the box here, and they really made this venue come to life. It was a character in what we were doing. So I thought it was a great venue for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's one thing that I myself as a fan, and Mike and I have talked about it on previous episodes, is that because of the pandemic, it's forced a lot of these boxing promoters and networks to really, I guess, try to perfect the television aspect of how it looks on TV, how it comes across. And I think it's cool. Like you said, like the Top Rank has like that nightclub feel, and then Mexico has that red carpet. I think it's interesting, and it especially to casual fans, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a lot of different people trying a lot of different things, and credit to everyone who's trying, because it's so much work in general just to put on a boxing show. And now you're throwing in the pandemic and all these safety protocols and bubbles, and people need to get tested, and then there's zones and there's different things going on. And it just makes it so much more difficult. So credit to everyone who's trying, credit to everyone who's putting on shows. And then I think if you can add a nice, unique twist, the way that Ring City USA did, and bring to life a venue. I mean, think about how outside of the box the thinking was, taking the parking lot right at Wildcard. So people have obviously know the Wildcard. It's $5 a day to train inside. People probably never thought, and I spoke to Freddie about this. He never could have imagined something like this, and he loved it. He loved the ring in the parking lot, and he said he loved it so much he might keep that ring there. He might try to train a couple fighters out there. I don't know what that's going to do for parking, but yeah. So I like I said, credit to everyone who's trying, but I obviously, it was such an innovative and cool thing to be a part of.
One last thing before we kind of get into the reviews of this past weekend. We had obviously mentioned to a couple people you were coming on. And there was a couple people who reached out, who messaged me, and others who, texted me and saying, "Oh, ask him about his time at HBO." Because, HBO Boxing to a lot of boxing fans is very nostalgic. And I guess one question that I would ask is like, what was the most interesting or the most, memorable, I guess, project or moment during your time at HBO?
There was so many memorable fights and projects. Just a little bit about my time there. I got to work on live boxing in the production truck and go to all these fights and interview these fighters. I got to work on the 24/7 documentary series, which was awesome. As a producer on that, I got to produce features. I got to work on the fight game with Jim Lampley. I got to literally in some of these huge fights have the best possible seat in the house, literally sitting next to Jim Lampley. And my vantage point was probably the same as the other three judges. There's probably three, one on each side of the ring. And then there was me. One of those was definitely memorable, which was Pacquiao versus Tim Bradley 1, which I think a lot of people consider it a robbery. And it was just interesting for me to be there right up against the ring. I personally, no offense to Tim Bradley, he did his thing in terms of the heart that he had there, but and the will to try to win. I had that fight 10-2 for Pacquiao. Right. So that was definitely memorable. There was a lot of really great 24/7 shoots we did as well. I was in Amir Khan's camp when he was training for Canelo. And there was one scene that I was lucky enough to field produce where it was about his culture and who he is. And we actually took a trip with him to his place of worship, and just to see the way that younger people and people in the community look at boxers as stars and as heroes, and just to see a community rally around someone that was another really cool scene to work on. got to work directly with Miguel Cotto and interview him. So just, someone like a legend like that, Manny Pacquiao as well. So just so many, and in terms of just memorable fights, I mean, there was so many, just random ones that are coming to the top of my head. And I'm sure I'm forgetting some really big ones, but going to Germany for Klitschko, David Haye it just felt epic just to be there for a Klitschko fight in Germany for a soccer stadium. Not that the fight was any good, but just to be in Germany for a Vladimir Klitschko fight, I think was an experience. Being at Manny Pacquiao versus Marquez 4 when Pacquiao was knocked out, just in terms of how epic that rivalry was and how historic that was. And I think one of the loudest moments was Sergio Martinez versus Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. in that last round. And I don't think I've ever heard an arena ever be that loud when people thought Chavez maybe, it was kind of a stinker, Sergio doing his thing for 11 rounds. And then Chavez gets the knockdown and then and also the slip in that last round and the crowd just going wild. And as I'm talking, I'm just remembering so many more. Being in Argentina for Sergio Martinez's fight is kind of come home fight. Going to Macau for some Manny Pacquiao fights. So many memories, and I'm probably forgetting so many, but just those were off the top of my head.
Sounds like a terrible job.
Yeah. Oh man, brutal.
No, you definitely were part of history in a lot of those moments, which is awesome. Not too many people could say that, so that's definitely awesome. Obviously moving on to our fight reviews from this past Friday, the 18th of December, from the Seminole Hard Rock and Casino in Hollywood, Florida, not California, but Florida, on DAZN. Gennady Triple G Golovkin stops Kamil Szeremeta and retains his IBF and IBO middleweight world titles. And you guys tell me if you agree. Obviously, Curran, you're our guest of honor here, so I'm going to go to you first. Did Gennady Golovkin impress you this past Friday? Do you think that he could have stopped him earlier and maybe he just wanted to get some rounds in because there's been a pandemic?
I 100% was impressed by Gennady Triple G Golovkin. I am one of the people that thinks that there's a lot left with Triple G. I thought that before this fight. If you look at his fight, if you look at his record, there's only 2 blemishes. One is the draw with Canelo and the loss to Canelo. Obviously, a lot of people think he won the first fight. Second fight was much closer. I think there's a lot left in Triple G, and I was, of course, very, very impressed with his performance. Knocking a guy down with a jab. I don't care who you are. I don't care how experienced that person is. That's just impressive to me. And so I was absolutely 100% impressed. And I do think he wanted to get some rounds in. I think if he really wanted to push and get a knockout, he could. We've seen fighters do that. If you look at Edgar Berlanga, he tweeted about it after he wanted to get that first round knockout, right? And so you see the way a fighter acts when they want to get that. And it seemed like G was okay with maybe not pushing too hard, but staying comfortable, but still having power, knocking his opponent down 4 times. So I think he got the rounds in, which is good. And I think he looked great. And obviously I think we all want to see Canelo Alvarez next, if that's possible.
What do you think, Mike?
Yeah, I thought Triple G looked good. He definitely looked good on the scales for someone of that age. I don't know how Szeremeta was the IBF mandatory. That was kind of the biggest surprise from the weekend. It's just kind of, where does Triple G go from here? Obviously, I think all roads lead to Canelo. I'm sure, DAZN want that for the payday. Triple G probably wants that because that's his biggest payday. But then after that, unless he fights the Charlos, the Eubank Juniors, the Andrades, I don't know whether they're going to be the completely wrong style for Triple G. Triple G kind of likes the slower, flat-footed guys that kind of stand in front of him. Charlo is maybe that. Chris Eubank Jr. and Andrade, definitely not. So I think if they pick the right opponents, we'll probably see, Triple G around for another year or 2.
How many years, Curran, do you think that Triple G has left in boxing, realistically?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I know that when he first signed the DAZN deal, they were talking about it being a 6-fight deal, and that was kind of what he had in mind. I've heard conflicting things, and who knows the exact details, but maybe this wasn't part of that deal, or the deal is increased or not. I'm not really sure. So I'm not sure, but I think I definitely think, like I said, he's 38 years old, but I think there's still some fight left in there in a big way. And he's doing what he needs to do against the opposition that's in front of him. I mean, you mentioned he likes a certain type of opponent. I mean, he's taken down every single opponent that's been in front of him except for Canelo. So it's not, in my opinion, he's not, I don't see him like cherry picking in any way. And I do think there's a lot of interesting fights. Obviously, Andrade, BJ Saunders, Canelo would be great. Someone on one of the broadcasts, I think, mentioned they thought it would be interesting to see a rematch with Danny Jacobs because that was a close fight at the time it happened, and now Triple G being even older. So I guess there's an argument that could be made for that. So I think he definitely has a lot of options, and I'm looking forward to see what he does next.
Assuming he doesn't get the Canelo fight, obviously we'll talk about the Canelo fight later on in the episode, but assuming Triple G doesn't get that next, I mean, I guess from a realistic standpoint, who could you see him being in the ring with next?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think realistically, if he would, if they could make it happen, Andrade or BJ Saunders, right? I mean, I feel like those would be, I feel like the Andrade fight would be really interesting. We haven't seen Andrade necessarily tested in that way because people have avoided him so much. So it seems like and I know we're going to talk about the Canelo fight. If you were watching that broadcast, it seems like Andrade really, really, really wanted that fight. I don't know if that was his motivation for not saying Canelo is the pound for pound number one fighter. I don't see the, necessarily even the connection of if he says he's the pound for pound number one, how does that change his ability to get that fight? So, I mean, that's another conversation we can talk about after. But I think at this point, Andrade, 32 years old, it'd be nice to see him tested against a top fighter. I'm not saying that that's his fault. He had the Saunders fight lined up, and that one fell through. And it's not like, fighters have been, lining up around the block to fight him necessarily. That's partially because of his style, partially because part of boxing in 2020 and going back is about marketing yourself, making yourself a marketable opponent. Even if you have a more technical style, obviously, like if you look at Floyd Mayweather, it's a very technical style, but he was able to market himself and become the person he was, where it was just can't miss TV. So to answer your question, I mean, if it's not Canelo, I guess one of those guys would be great.
Do you see Triple G fighting at 168 at all before the end of his career?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly possible. If that's where he has to meet Canelo, that would be an interesting decision for him. I think when he first came out, if I remember it correctly, we at HBO we covered his U.S. debut. I was there at Turning Stone. That was in 2012 against Proxa. And I believe in the post-fight interview of that fight, if I'm not mistaken, he said, "I'll fight anyone from 154." And I think he said up to 168. I think that's what he said at that time. Now, obviously that was in 2012, so things may have changed. I also know at that time, I think they said they would have actually gone down to welter to fight Mayweather had that fight ever come together. Or maybe down to 54, maybe like some kind of middle ground. So would he go up to 68? I mean, yeah, I mean, if the right opportunity is there, he's probably obviously at this point in his career looking for good opportunities.
Yeah, the money, the paydays, obviously. There was also he was also a little bit in the news, I guess, at least on the Twitter sphere and in boxing. I mean, we all know how boxing is on Twitter. But he had made a comment, obviously, about Oscar De La Hoya recently, during the last week, during his fight week. I don't want to say I'm going to quote him exactly, but it was something along the lines of, like, he would essentially kill him in the ring, or he'd be happy to, or something along those lines. Don't quote me exactly verbatim on that. But I saw a couple Twitter threads online following that. I think Andre Ward had tweeted something where he kind of was pretty much was trying to push light on it in terms of saying, well, if you guys went after Deontay Wilder for his past comments, about Tyson Fury, why not Triple G, kind of keep that same energy type? I mean, I'll start with you, Curran. What's your take on that whole situation?
Yeah, if you followed my work at all or listened to any of my podcasts or things like that, fighter safety has been a huge thing that I've talked about. I did a full episode on fighter safety. There's a lot that we need to do in this sport to make it safer, and that starts with trying to get rid of the whole machismo in terms of the, that fighter shouldn't quit. He should have kept going type thing. If a fighter wants to stop fighting, then in my opinion, as fans, as observers, we should be supportive of that decision. And that's the same thing for trainers and things like that. And in terms of the comments, I had a chance to interview Deontay Wilder, and I asked him that. I said, in 2019, there was 5 deaths in the sport. Do you still feel that way? His answer was, I am who I am. He basically said that's who he is, and he stands by that comment. So that may be a fighter's mentality. Once you go in the ring at such a high level, you may need to have that type of mentality. I'll do anything to get this win. And in terms of the comment about Triple G, I mean, yeah, we should, if Andre Ward's point is that we should be consistent, then absolutely, definitely should be consistent across the board. I mean, if anyone says that, then we should question that. And so I was able to ask Wilder about it. If I had a chance to ask Triple G, I would ask Triple G about it too, for sure. What
do you think, Mike?
Yeah, I kind of agree with Andre Ward. If we kind of jump down Wilder for it, we should kind of obviously jump down Triple G for it. I don't know whether it's just something they say to try to, get a fight. Like, I think we all know kind of Wilder kind of created this persona for Fight Week. And I think it's more to do with that, to sell the fight. Like Curran touched on, people need to sell fights. Either you want the guy to win or you want the guy to get knocked out because of something he said, which is kind of the Floyd Mayweather role. So I personally think that, Wilder and, Triple G, it's just kind of more, showmanship than anything else.
Right. Yeah. I was thinking in terms of, when I heard the comments from Triple G, he's been at the top of the sport for quite a few years now. And he's had some of the best PR teams in the sport of boxing, and he knows the PR side of things. He's a very stoic guy, and if you've been as close to him, like on media days or fights as we've been ringside or anything like that, you can see what type of guy he is, especially in front of the press. I would categorize him as PR savvy. So like a part of me thinks that he kind of knew what he was going to say, or he knew he was going to say that. And he like Mike mentioned, I think he might've said it a little bit for publicity, just to kind of drum up some attention. But he's always kind of had like this type of, I don't know why I want to say it's hatred, but this always kind of disdain for Oscar De La Hoya. He's mentioned in his past interviews, he would fight him if he had the chance, and but it gained some attention, so it worked, I guess, in some PR format. But I mean, I don't know, but like we were mentioning, it's like Andre Ward's right. Kind of try to be we need to be consistent with all these fighters, regardless of who they are, and because then there's issues on the social front and everything, and obviously everybody should be treated equally and kind of go from there, especially in the sport of boxing. Moving on to also this past Friday, I think it was on after the Triple G fight, and this was from the Galveston Island Convention Center in South Texas on Fight TV. In his first fight without Top Rank, Gilberto Zurdo Ramirez gets the 10th round stoppage over Alfonso Lopez, and this was for the NABF light heavyweight title. So Curran, Zurdo Ramirez, he promoted this fight on his own. Where does he go from here? I mean, because obviously I'm sure working in the industry as you have in a professional level, especially with HBO, it's very expensive not only to put on a fight, but have a broadcast partner of some sort and promote it and be the main promoter in a sense. Can he sustain this model?
It's very, very difficult to do it that way. I believe this was his second fight at light heavyweight. So obviously, if he's going to be looking at names in that division, I would think. But in terms of the how to promote your own fights, it's obviously possible. It's definitely difficult because what promoters are going to do is obviously market you. They're going to have a team around you to work with things like commissions and the venue, put these things together, media obligations, right? Things like that, undercards, all of these things. And so that it's going to be tough to do that on your own. I know Saddam Ali, just as an example that came to my mind, tried to do that for a long time, promote himself, I believe. And so definitely not the easiest thing in the world to do. I think a better way to go about it is if you can build yourself up at a certain point and then and almost be like a freelance fighter. So I think Mayweather did this late in his career. Miguel Cotto did that. He was at Top Rank for a long time and then was kind of freelancing with different promoters. One fight with Golden Boy. It seems like Canelo may be on the path to do that. Obviously, he was with Golden Boy for so long, and then this most recent fight was under the Matchroom banner with Callum Smith being on Matchroom. He had a chance. He was, it's, at least from the rumors, it sounded like he was talking to PBC, talking to other people. So I think that's a better way to go about it. Have someone like a co-promoter or someone that can handle those logistics and those type of things. I think that'll be, and I would say, unless you have a really, really huge audience and your audience, you command that audience so much that they're going to tune in wherever you go. You say, I'm on this place and they're going to be there. So to answer your question, it's possible, but I think it's pretty tough.
So he's at 175 pounds. I think he's mentioned that it's very difficult for him to go back to 168, based on that weight cut. So obviously you have guys like Artur Beterbiev, Dimitri Bivol. And I think when I looked at the rankings, at least for the WBC, I think he might be number 1 on the WBC rankings.
That's a surprise.
Yeah.
A Mexican number 1 in the WBC.
Well, it happens. It's not the first time or the last, but and I think he's in the top maybe 7 or 8 in the other primary sanctioning bodies. Like Curran mentioned, this is his second fight, I believe, at light heavyweight, 175 pounds. I don't think anybody has him as number 1, obviously, at the 175 pound category. But maybe a fight with like Dimitri Bivol. What do you think about that fight, Curran?
Yeah, I'd love to see that fight. I mean, I would love to see Bivol, be tested, see him in a tough fight. So I would definitely like to see that. I'm looking at the rankings as you were speaking. Yeah, at least from what I'm looking at here, number 1 in WBC, looks like he's 4 in the WBA and 8 in the WBO. So obviously he's going to be looking at big names at 175. Dimitri Bivol, he's 30 years old. He's only had 17 fights. So it'd be great to see him against anyone, really. I mean, right. He came up in terms of notoriety towards the kind of the end of the run at HBO. So we were able to see him do his thing. He seemed like he had a lot of talent at the time. And I think that he's someone that you'd like to see more of, just see them tested, kind of the way that we were talking about Demetrius Andrade. At a certain point, we want to learn about these fighters, and the best way obviously to do that is big matchups. So that's what I would say. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I could agree with that. And I think, like you said, especially with 41 fights and 41 victories, 41-0, I think anybody as a casual fan would see that as a record, be like, oh, wow, this guy must be great. Which we're not saying he's a bad boxer. Obviously, he's at being able to fight at that professional level. Obviously, you have to have some type of talent. But us as the type of boxing fans and personalities that we are, we have a different eye for the sport. And his resume hasn't really backed up in a sense, or solidified that record that he has. So yeah, and obviously there was reports that when he left Top Rank that there was some issues in how they were handling his career. And then I think Mike had mentioned in a prior episode here at the last round that his wife also wanted more money, or there was some issues, some political issues right there. But when he left Top Rank, I thought, okay, well, maybe he's serious about trying to get these big fights, with these big 175 pounders. Even Sergey Kovalev is there. Sergey Kovalev obviously isn't the guy he used to be 5-6 years ago. But even throwing him in there with maybe an Anthony Yard, or Sergey Kovalev. I mean, especially a Kovalev, I think is some type of name. What do you think, Mike?
I think he kind of just needs to look at himself and decide, what he wants to do. Like you touched on, he's 41-0. He's trying to promote himself. He's 29 years old. I don't think he attracts a great legion of fans where people are going to be jumping to sign him. You're kind of looking at the top people in the light heavyweight division. He needs to try to side himself with DAZN or the PBC really to get any of those big fights. And unfortunately, I don't see it really happening. I think it's kind of like risk and reward. The fight with Bivol would be a good fight technically for us as diehard fans, but neither of them are going to create a lot of money. The Kovalev's already got a fight lined up for the beginning of next year. Artur nobody wants to fight him. I think he'd smoke Ramirez. Joe Smith's tied up. He's already fought Jesse Hart twice. Maybe Jean Pascal, but even him, he's what is he now? About 38 years old, but he's going through like a purple patch in his career. He's still one to be reckoned with. So yeah. I don't know what he's doing. I think he's kind of cut his nose off to spite his face. That old phrase with what he's trying to do, trying to promote himself.
Yeah, I would say real quick. I think in terms of the record, people say that all the time. It's like, oh, well, 41-0, but who has he fought? I mean, at the end of the day, though, there were people across the ring who were trying to beat him. Now, there's obviously levels to this. I mean, we were talking about Edgar Berlanga earlier, and I think same thing there. Like, you're like, well, who is he fought? Well, it's people that weren't trying to get knocked out in the first round. And if it's that easy to do, then why haven't that many other people done it? So I still give credit to people who are able to do this. Like, if you look at someone like Deontay Wilder, who I believe made it to the 40s with, undefeated and almost all knockouts, all but one fight, I believe. So I still give credit to these people who are able to do that. But at the end of the day, there's obviously levels to this game. So if you can look at a lot of fighters who maybe, for example, a lot of fights in Mexico, not elsewhere in the world, you have a lot of wins, then that person fights elsewhere in the world, and it's just levels, different type of fighters, and you see this person get tested. Same thing with Callum Smith in terms of the level of competition, and then obviously, going to Canelo, and we saw the difference there on Saturday night. So I think we just want to learn about these guys, learn more about who they are as fighters, and the best way is big matchups, obviously, or at least names, people that we've heard of, to your point.
Right. Yeah. And then also, obviously his platform, at least for a good part of his career, he was with Top Rank, I think he was on ESPN for a little bit, and then obviously some other HBO cards and stuff like that. So, not too many professional fighters get to that level to be on global platforms like that. So that also invites more scrutiny onto your career, especially when an opponent specifically is put across the ring from you. You're going to get more scrutiny. I mean, it's just like, we've talked about Triple G and Canelo and all these guys. The bigger your stock gets, the more popular you get, there's going to be more negativity that comes along with it. And you just kind of have to deal with it. So I think that's obviously one of the main issues with Zurdo Ramirez is that, his platform, and he's known by a lot of diehard fans. So a lot of people just want to see him tested, which is, I guess, if you want to look at it, and you guys tell me if you agree or not, I guess it's kind of like a good thing in a way when fans say well, yeah, we want to see him in there with somebody of comparable talent across the ring, which is pretty much saying well, we kind of believe that he might have a shot to beat that guy who's just as good as him, and they can produce an excellent fight. So in a weird way, it's kind of like a confidence booster, if that makes sense. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, if you look at Tyson Fury when he was on the way up, at least if I remember correctly, he, against Vladimir Klitschko, I don't believe he was the favorite by any means. I think a lot of people were probably picking Klitschko, as was I at the time. And, reasons for that were, okay, who exactly has he fought? Has he fought top competition? He got knocked down by Steve Cunningham, who was a cruiserweight for a long time. So you're saying is this guy for real? Is he just talk? And in terms of learning about fighters, we learned he outworked Klitschko. Klitschko didn't do much in that fight, but at the end of the day, Tyson Fury outworked him. And then again, against Deontay Wilder, and then all of the other fighters that he's beaten. Now he's obviously on top with Anthony Joshua here at the heavyweight division. So in that same way, it's someone that we didn't necessarily know enough about, and then we learned more about and saw what they were able to do. Now, I'm not saying that's at all the case here, but that's what we need to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, hopefully we could see him in a significant fight next year. I think what definitely helps him is that he's kind of like in pretty much a free agent mode. So if any promoter, any of the main ones like, PBC, Matchroom, Top Rank, or any of these guys, Golden Boy, approach him, it should be fairly easy. Well, I shouldn't even say Top Rank. I don't think that's going to happen for a while. But if any of these other promoters approach him, it should be kind of fairly easy to make a fight with him, just because he's not really tied to anybody. He's tied to himself. So I guess that's, and obviously we know that's a big obstacle in the sport of boxing. So hopefully that helps. But hopefully he fights somebody significant in his next fight, or for that matter in 2021. Moving on, this past Saturday, the 19th of December, from the Alamo Dome in San Antonio, Texas, on DAZN, Saul Canelo Alvarez gets the 12-round unanimous decision win over the 6'3" Callum Smith, who suffers the first loss of his career. Alvarez becomes a WBC and WBA and Ring Magazine super middleweight champion. What's your initial take on Canelo's performance, Curran?
Very, very impressive performance, of course. I mean, I think everyone watching thought that. We see these photos at the weigh-in, at the press conference. It looks like they're like photoshopped with the height difference there. And clearly Canelo was able to make up for that. I thought Canelo's defense was just absolutely like next level, like head movement, blocking punches. I thought that was absolutely brilliant. And, obviously Callum Smith with a bit of a disappointing performance. I tweeted about it. I said, Callum Smith is putting on a clinic on how not to use his height and reach advantage. He wasn't fighting at distance. He was crouching down to Canelo's level. I'm not sure why. He wasn't working the jab at length. He was backing up and staying on the ropes. And I think that was like a clinic on how not to use your height and reach. So that was obviously pretty disappointing for Callum Smith.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I thought that was very surprising as well, that he wasn't utilizing his height and he crouched down to Canelo's level. Like, I expected that at certain moments throughout the fight. He would crouch down to maybe try to create a shot or find an opening. But it seemed like he did that for a majority of the fight. And he started it from the early rounds. And I was watching it, I was actually watching it with my dad, and I told him, I was just like, uh-oh. I was like, if he keeps doing that, he's definitely not going to win. So I'm glad you pointed that out, because that was something I noticed right away, and obviously it didn't help. But I always thought, like, being at 6'3", essentially being the bigger guy in that sense, he was going to use his height. Canelo, they say sometimes he's 5'9", but that's kind of being generous. He's more like 5'8". And like you mentioned, we thought these photos that were circulating around social media, a lot of people thought, is this Photoshop? What is this? Like, this guy's so much bigger. But in the ring, kind of crouches down to Canelo's 5'8" frame, and it kind of looks like they're the same size in a way. But go ahead, Mike, you had a question?
I was just going to say, we kind of touched on it last week. I brought it up because when we had Dan Canobio on, he kind of touched on that, the height and stuff and the reach. And I said, Callum Smith doesn't fight like that. For some reason, he never uses his natural attributes. He's very good on the inside, which unfortunately is Canelo's game. He really should have switched it up and used, that reach, that height, made it a very, very boring fight. Just kind of hit and move, and just being that fleet of foot boxer. But it's just not his natural way of fighting, which is obviously when you get in the ring, it's something that you kind of always resort to. And I just don't think he was good enough. Personally, to me, I think the fights that he's had on his resume so far, like George Groves, a one-armed George Groves that then retired after the World Boxing Super Series. And I'm English. I wanted Callum Smith to win, but I just don't think, I think he's slightly overrated. Because apart from George Grove, he hasn't really got another big name on his resume.
Yeah, I think if you look at that fight, and it kind of plays to the theme that we've been talking about this whole episode, which is learning about who fighters are. And part of that is if you have a plan B, right? If things aren't going right in plan A and you can figure something out in terms of plan B. Didn't seem like Callum Smith had a plan B. I agree with Brian Kenny, who said during the broadcast, he said, I don't know if it's a game plan for Callum Smith. I don't think he has the game. And I think that sums it up. Unfortunately for Callum Smith, he can obviously go back to the drawing board and work on some things, but it didn't seem like there was another gear to go to when he needed another gear to go to.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good analogy. it seems like he was just stuck in first gear. And it also felt too like he had no power behind his punches. I know he was trying to connect, and Canelo just, his defense and his head movements, obviously excellent. But like, even when he was throwing or anything like that, if you kind of compare it to Canelo's shots, there was definitely a difference in terms of, power and movement in that regard. But, I think you're right, Curran, when you said that there was no plan B. He had no plan B. Like, I couldn't even tell just based on watching it what even plan A was. I think whatever plan A was, within the first 3 rounds, I think he thought, oh, plan A is not going to work and we don't have a plan B. So I just got to figure it out. And he never figured it out.
Yeah, I mean, you could hear the thuds of Canelo's punches, and you really didn't at all with Callum's punches. And it also seemed, we saw the photos, or at least you saw him walking back to the locker room, Callum-Smith, and you saw the torn bicep kind of protruding out of his arm. So obviously that bothered him. Who knows exactly when that happened? It seems like Canelo was targeting that as well. So obviously that plays into it, but I don't think that, I think Eddie Hearn himself said that it's not like that would have changed the fight necessarily if the bicep was healthy. So, obviously would have liked to see more from Callum-Smith for sure.
I definitely give Callum credit though, because like there was one point I think in the fight, maybe multiple points, but definitely one point, I believe maybe 7th round or 8th round, where I thought, oh, he's at least going to go down once. And that might be it, because Canelo was definitely turning up the heat on his shots. And you can tell he was a little bit more predator wise, I guess, if you want to categorize it like that. But Callum-Smith took some nasty shots, and not just on his head, on his face, to the body, but like you mentioned, he had that torn bicep, and you can see from those pictures when he's walking back into the backstage area, you can see that bulge on his arm. So he was taking back like hard shots all over his body, but he never went down once. And I thought for sure he was going to hit the canvas at least once, and he never did. I mean, I don't think he's ever been down in his career, has he?
I mean, he definitely gets credit for not going down. It seemed like Canelo fought a smart fight, because early on you could tell he was really trying to figure out the timing. Okay, this guy is significantly taller than me. He's got a longer reach. So let me not go in too early. And I was looking at it early. It seemed like he was laying back on his combinations. We know Canelo obviously has great defense, but he is a great combination puncher, especially to the body. We've seen that so many times. But he was holding back a little bit. He wasn't throwing full combinations. He was just starting them off just to kind of gauge the distance. And then obviously as the fight went on, he realized this guy can't hurt me. And he started to unload on the combinations. There was a few rounds where it definitely seemed like he was trying to go for the knockout. I think in round 9 and round 10, it seemed like he really wanted to get this guy out of there. I had it a shutout personally for Canelo. I guess people could argue that maybe he got round 5. Round 1 was kind of a feeling out round, so that could probably go either way. But other than that, I mean, it seemed like pretty much every round went in Canelo's favor.
What'd you think, Mike?
I agree with Curran. I think wrong game plan. I think he's just another level, Canelo, every time we see him now, he just kind of shows that he's added another string to his bow. The head movement against Jacobs, the different combinations. He's also can stick to, different game plans, different weights, different size people. He really is just the full package at the minute. He's like 57 fights into his career, 30 years old, and he's just getting better and better all the time. And in my book, he's the pound for pound number 1 at the minute, because, he's won the titles, he's done the different weight divisions, and he also has the resume. He's fought a lot of the great people, and he picked this fight himself when he could have fought, the WBC's mandatory, in Avni Yildirim, and had a quick and easy payday. But, he dared to be great.
Absolutely. Yeah. He definitely dared to be great. Before we kind of move on to his pound for pound and, that whole discussion, obviously the pound for pound talk in the sport of boxing is definitely a big one. People get all up in arms about different, rankings and stuff like that. Canelo is now, he has a WBC title. They kind of came in at the 11th hour and snuck their title in there. And like Mike mentioned, Avni Yildirim is technically next in line to fight for that title. I mean, realistically, Curran, do you see Canelo taking that fight? I mean, like, I don't, just because like he feels like he wants some type of challenge or he wants a name. People have mentioned Android. We mentioned Android at the beginning of the show. You mentioned him, how he kind of was upset that his name wasn't being mentioned alongside Canelo. He didn't want to, label him as a pound for pound guy for some reason. But Canelo has said in past interviews that Android, isn't a pleasing style. He's like, what's the reason for me to fight him? I feel like he would say the same thing about Yildirim. So, I mean, would he have to vacate that title? What do you think, Curran?
Yeah, so a couple of things on what you said. I mean, there was a lot of talk, obviously, post-fight about pound for pound number one. And then there was also talk about if he was legitimately a 4-division champion. I mean, if you look at the Kovalev fight, it's still an impressive performance. It doesn't matter how washed up or anything that you think Kovalev is. If you're going by the kind of the industry standard right now, which is there's 4 titles, and you're recognizing the top person in those, with the WBA has the super champion, the regular, you're recognizing the top person. You kind of have to be consistent across the board with that type of thinking. If you're not going to be consistent with that, then you're going to have to go back to almost everyone's title defenses and things like that and say, well, was this a legitimate opponent? Was this not? And that's kind of a slippery slope in that way. So you're gonna have to, even though it is maddening that there's 4 different main titles and then, franchise titles and regular titles and all these things. And it is maddening, and it definitely is not the best thing for the sport. It'd be great if there was one champion per division. I think we all want that. But if you're going to look at it kind of the industry standard way, then you have to give credit for when those things happen, regardless of how you feel about certain opponents. And in terms of who Canelo fights next, there's a lot of options there. I guess it depends which promotion he kind of links up with. You mentioned Charlo, who's on the PBC end of it. Benavidez is another one. Caleb Plant would be another one. If we're staying in the matchroom world, Saunders and Andrade. And then, of course, I mean, we all want to see Triple G, the trilogy. We, as boxing fans, as observers of this sport, we do not like fights over marinating or marinating at all, for that matter. Let's get these guys in, especially at the age that Triple G is at, 38 years old, Canelo at 30. They had the 2 close fights. They should definitely do the trilogy. I mean, you saw GGG the night before. No reason that we can't see that in 2021. There's a bunch of big fights that we can hopefully get in 2021. Spence Crawford would be great. Wilder Fury 3 would be great, but it would also be great to see Canelo Triple G 3 in 2021.
What do you think, Mike?
I agree with Curran. I think the Triple G fight kind of makes sense. They kind of had them on the same timeline on purpose. Triple G goes the day before, kind of an easy-ish opponent, gets the knockout, looks good. Canelo the next day keeps it in the same time frame and also in people's minds because they're very close together. I could also see the Billy Joe Saunders fight. I guess that he would have fought either Billy Joe Saunders or Callum Smith for this one because DAZN was opening up in the UK and in Europe. So it made sense to try to attract those subscriptions by using an English fighter. Obviously, it's still new, so I could see Billy Joe Saunders maybe next year. But at the same time, if he did fight Anthony Yildirim because he's a mandatory, I'd kind of throw him an easy one because look at his last few opponents. They've all been pretty good, a pretty good resume. So to give him an easy fight against Yildirim, who I don't understand why is even the mandatory since, I think, was it 2 fights ago, he got smoked by Chris Eubank Jr. I don't even know how he's even up there, but WBC for you.
We've had a lot of questions about the way that rankings work. Some guys are ranked high in one type of entity and not at all ranked in another, and you're like, kind of what's going on there, and that obviously causes a lot of problems, especially when these entities enforce their mandatories, and that may not be the best fighting the best, and that's obviously a huge problem. In terms of the Triple G and Canelo back-to-back, so you have to look at how that came together. Now, many people, like, for example, the Zone or Matchroom or others may, and fans, of course, may want Canelo Triple G3, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's what Canelo wants. If you look at Canelo's situation in 2020, he obviously had the falling out with Golden Boy, the lawsuit with the Zone, all of these issues. He probably wanted to make sure to get a fight in the calendar year of 2020. They gave him a date. Then they give Triple G a date. That doesn't necessarily mean that Canelo said, well, Triple G is going to fight the night before me. That means I want to fight him. Now, we as fans want him to fight him. At the end of the day, I think Canelo and Triple G definitely don't like each other. Triple G definitely wants to right that wrong. Canelo may think of it like, well, I'm the top dog. I may not want to give you this payday, right? Why should I give this to you? I already fought you twice. I've already beat you once. I never lost to you technically, right? First fight being a draw. So in his mind, he may not want to give Triple G the payday. We hope that's not the case. And I think it's our job as fans to demand this fight, keep talking about this fight. If public keeps asking for it, hopefully these fights happen. Obviously Mayweather-Pacquiao happened way past its date, but fans kept talking about it and it happened. At the end of the day, I do think Canelo will fight Triple G again because he is a warrior. He's gotten in there with people that you never really thought that he would go in there with. Fought Mayweather when he was only 23 years old. He gets credit for that. He went up to 175 pounds. It doesn't matter that it was an over-the-hill Kovalev. He still challenged himself and went to a higher weight class. So I think he is about greatness. I think he does care about his legacy. And I think there will be enough public demand to eventually make that fight happen.
I think, Canelo's the modern day Floyd. He'll fight whoever he decides. He's like the king of the sport, and he just points out like, it's your turn. And then everyone takes it because it's the biggest payday.
Yeah, I mean, if that's true, then you would say that, okay, well, Floyd, he fought a lot of big names, but not always necessarily at the exact right time, right? Miguel Cotto a little later on in his career. Manny Pacquiao obviously was way past when we wanted to see it, and other fighters as well. We hope that's not the case with Canelo. Now, the one thing that I think in terms of the sport as a whole, the hardcore fans, the people that are probably listening to this podcast right now, boxing fans, things like that, are going to watch Canelo fight no matter what, are going to watch the sport. We obviously want to bring in the sports fans because boxing, it's such a great sport when you know the storylines and the champions are defined and the best are fighting the best, right? It's the best sport. So we want to bring in those sports fans. Now, in the past, for a big Mayweather fight, when casual sports fans or sports fans who are casual boxing fans tuned in, they may be disappointed because there may be not a lot of action because it was a technical Floyd Mayweather fight, right? A lot of defense. It was a brilliant performance, but it's like watching a pitcher pitch a no-hitter versus a home run hitter. Oh. Canelo is probably closer to the home run hitter. We've seen him knock people out. We've seen him with this beautiful combination punching, dominate people with offense. He is a counterpuncher, but he still has a lot of offense. So the one hopeful thing there is that if he does do his career that way, where he's kind of picking who he's fighting, at least when the sports world tunes in, they will hopefully be more entertained by that.
Curran, you mentioned Brian Kenny earlier in our conversation here, and then we talked about Canelo being a 4-division world champion, 154, 160, 168, and 175. Brian Kenny, who was obviously one of the commentators for DAZN, a couple of DAZN broadcasts, has an interesting take on his divisional championships. I believe there was a little back and forth. I don't know if it was Chris Mannix or Sergio Mora during the broadcast, but Brian Kenny had said like he only recognized Canelo as a 3-division world champion, and he didn't count Sergey Kovalev, that win at 175 pounds. He didn't count that because Brian Kenny looks at it as more as like, look, there's one guy in each division who is the guy, and you have to, and that's who you have to beat to be the divisional champion, to be recognized. What do you think about that as a take on that whole situation?
Yeah, no, I really like Brian Kenny. I think he's great. But in terms of that situation, so I guess if you're going to take issue with Canelo's fight, I was at the Matthew Hatton fight where I believe it was a catchweight, and then I believe it was for the 154-pound title, and Matthew Hatton was more of a welterweight, so you could take some issue there. In terms of the Kovalev fight and that being for 175 pounds, what I was saying before is that you have to look at it in the industry standard way, which is the 4 titles. If you don't want to look at it that way, that's fine, but then you're going to have to be consistent in that way and how you look at it everywhere for everyone you're speaking about. So if you're only saying that there's one guy, main champion for each division, we'd love to have that in an ideal world. That's not the case. But let's say your take is, okay, there's only one guy who is the champion at each division. Then anyone else who fights any of the other title holders, then you also have to not count that as them winning a title. So then you have to go back and look at all of these people who have done these amazing things. Manny Pacquiao and all the weight classes that he won. We mentioned Oscar De La Hoya. He won in multiple weight classes. There's so many fighters. So you're going to have to go back to all of those and say, well, wait a minute. Was that fight versus the guy in that division? You have to be consistent in however you look at it. So I understand what he's saying. But I just think that, like I said, I think that makes a slippery slope, because the issue then becomes what defines that guy, right? People are going to have different opinions on who is that guy. One guy has one title, one has another. How are we necessarily saying one is the man in the division? There's going to be certain, in certain cases, it's going to be defined. Like we know Canelo is the guy. Great. But in other cases, it's going to be, okay, well, who is the top guy? And so that becomes a little bit more subjective. So if you want to think about it that way, that's fine, but then you just have to be consistent all the way across the board.
What do you think, Mike?
No, I agree. I think we have all these, these different belts and stuff like that, but it's kind of hard to decide at sometimes, who is the number one in the division. Is it always the guy that has the WBC? Not necessarily. It just really depends on what you like. And obviously we know that certain promotions kind of side with certain belts, like the WBA seems to always be with Matchroom, WBO with like Frank Warren and so on and so forth. So it's a debate we could be here for hours and days and weeks going over.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. But I always thought that was an interesting take from Brian Kenny. Like, I don't necessarily hate it, from the principle standpoint or where he's coming from. I can understand it, but I don't necessarily agree with that take, like on from 100% standpoint. But he stands by it. They went back and forth, and he was just like, no, he has to beat Artur Beterbiev at 175 pounds. I'm like, oh, please. I was like, if Canelo, I know Canelo, he's lauded and he's praised because, he goes up and down to these different weight classes, and he fights a lot of these guys who, they're champions and they're arguably the best in their divisions. But I think Beterbiev is definitely a different level in terms of competition, especially at a higher weight class, like 175 pounds. Mike, you had something?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, it was kind of refreshing to see the commentators talking openly, though, and not just, bigging up Canelo because he's essentially the home fighter. So, I like it when they actually kind of, speak their mind.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think in theory, we all agree that there should be one champion per division. Now, it's just about how we're actually doing that in practice. There needs to be some system in place, something to say, okay, this is how we are determining who that main guy is at every division, right? That we need to figure that out before we say, okay, this one doesn't count, this one counts.
Right. Yeah. And I think they mentioned on the broadcast, essentially the Ring Magazine belt is essentially kind of that way where, it's who beat the guy, I beat the guy, who beat the guy, in that kind of lineage. We've had Dougie Fisher obviously on here at the last round a couple times already in the past. And I think on the last time he was here, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, but I think it's when we asked him about if there was any bouts in the past that fighters have had other titles associated with that bout, and they decided, oh, you know what, we just want to fight for the ring title. And I think he mentioned one or two or three.
Barrera, I think.
I think it was a Barrera fight as well. Yeah, I think essentially, it's the whole Ring Magazine thing, but then you kind of get into more politics with that, just because Golden Boy does own the ring. So there's some people who, just because of that, they kind of discredit it, which, to some people it's unfair, and, but there's always issues. There's always politics in the sport of boxing.
There always is. And so if you look at it that way, if you're saying it's the lineal champ, then you may be discrediting another fighter who's at, let's say, for example, he's at the top of the division. He's undefeated. He's beat a lot of people. He has a different belt. And then we talked about mandatory. So now he's defending his belt with his mandatories, but his mandatory isn't that person who's that lineal champ or whatever. So he hasn't fought that person. Now you're taking away the opportunity for him to be a champion, right? In that scenario. Now, so it's very complicated. It's unfortunate that we have to deal with that. It's maddening at times. And it's obviously, if we want to get general sports fans to watch boxing, it would be great if we could clear that up and just have one guy per division. At the end of the day, that's what we all want. We just have to get the right process to do that.
Errol Spence was actually before we go to Errol Spence, Callum Smith, I think, mentioned in his post-fight interview that some difficulty in making 168, pretty much kind of speaking into existence that he might move up to 175. I mean, how do you guys think he would fare at light heavyweight if he moves up?
I think when you go through your first loss as a fighter, I think a lot of fighters take it in a lot of different ways. If you look at Deontay Wilder, he had his first loss against Tyson Fury. I actually interviewed the costume designers who created his costume, because that was one of the things he said. He said his costume weighed him down. And I just wanted to learn more about exactly happened there.
I saw an interview. I thought that was a very, very good guess. I was like, I was telling Mike, I was like, man, I wish we thought of that.
And it's just for me, I always love to get the interesting perspectives. And the overall point though, is that every fighter takes their first loss very different, especially we were talking a little bit about this earlier in terms of fighter safety and the fighter's mindset, right? When you're undefeated, literally no one has beat you in the ring. You have confidence. Probably, depending on who you are, that could go into cockiness, but that's the mindset you maybe need to perform at that level. So now someone takes that away from you. It's always interesting to see how people deal with it. And I've always been a fan of trying to do something different, a change of scenery, right? The definition of insanity is trying the same thing and expecting a different result, right? So you need to change things up. So if that's going to a different weight class, great. Maybe that helps his confidence and says, well, you know what? The issue was the weight. I was sucked down trying to make that weight, and now I'm going to go try something else. It could be getting a new trainer. It could be getting a different gym, training out of a different gym, a different location, a change of scenery, whatever that is. We were talking about Ring City earlier in the program. And in our first show, we had Ashaki Foster. I went down to Houston to interview him. He's originally from Orange, Texas. His key to victory was getting to Houston, linking up with Bobby Benton. That change of scenery is what helped him. He's undefeated since he's had that change of scenery. So that can always help fighters. So I'm definitely for whatever a fighter wants to do to make changes to get over that first loss and try to change things up.
Mike, what do you think, at least from the British boxing standpoint?
I think moving up to light heavyweight would be good. It's a division which is actually fairly strong on the British scene. You've got like Anthony Yard, Callum Johnson, Joshua Buatsi all coming through. Then obviously some other names that are obviously, DAZN and Matchroom. You've got Kovalev, Bivol, people like that. So it's a very, very strong division. And kind of touching on what Curran said, I could see, personally, I think he could do with moving away from Joe Gallagher. I don't like the fact that he doesn't use his natural attributes. Like I said, he's always fights on the inside when, he was huge for that division. Why not make, use of his reach and his height, stay on the outside and do that. So, some heavy punches in that light heavyweight division. So I think, that's another thing where it would be a good idea to really use that reach moving up there. But definitely, I think it'd be a good move, more natural weight for him because he's like 6'3", boiling down to super middleweight. I always thought was amazing because he's my height. And I haven't been 168 since I was at high school, probably.
Right. Yeah, it's easy for us to say too, like, oh, well, fight in a different way. Sometimes that's difficult in terms of the fighter's mentality and just how they grew up fighting and things like that. It's hard to unlearn those things. But when you look at someone like that, you say, hey, wait a minute, you have this length. Why are you not working behind the jab? And we've seen fighters reinvent themselves. Vladimir Klitschko got knocked down and knocked out a couple times early in his career. He linked up with the great Emmanuel Stewart, worked behind the jab, set up the right hand, right? Took a lot less chances. We saw Anthony Joshua make those changes when he had his rematch against Andy Ruiz, right? Much more technical style, work behind the jab, things like that. So it definitely can be done. And we'll see if it can be done, but sometimes it's just hard for fighters to do that. We were talking about Ring City in our second show. We were supposed to have Brandon Adams versus Serhii Bohachuk, a fight that we'll hopefully have in 2021. I'm definitely looking forward to that. We brought in Sonny Duverson to take on Brandon Adams. Sonny Duverson was the naturally taller fighter. We talked about, hey, are you going to work your jab? He says, I usually try to, but I end up brawling. He ended up brawling and he ended up getting knocked out in the second round. I asked him after, I said, hey, are you going to work the jab? He said, I just love to brawl. It's what I do. So sometimes that's just innate into who fighters are. Sometimes they can make the adjustments. It will be interesting to see which path Callum Smith takes after this.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. He's definitely, I don't even think he's 30 yet. I think he's 29. So he still has quite a few years left ahead of him. And he shouldn't take this loss as any type of negative asterisks to his career, losing to pretty much the best guy in the world.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with what you said. And I think in terms of what we can do in terms of helping the sport along, fighter safety, we talked about it. It's okay if you want to stop. It's also okay if you take on a fight and lose. That's totally fine, right? Because we want to promote the best fighting the best. We don't want to promote fighters trying to protect the O on their record, their undefeated record, and not facing the best fighters. So it's literally totally fine if you take a loss. If you look at Canelo, he's the pound for pound #1 fighter. He commands the most money. He's a free agent right now. He's doing whatever he wanted. He took a chance against Floyd Mayweather. He sucked down to 152 pounds. He was 23 years old. He probably learned a ton from that fight, and that probably helped him become the fighter he is. And we're not taking anything away from him. So we, in my opinion, we shouldn't do that to other fighters who have a loss in the same way.
Absolutely. And you mentioned Canelo being a free agent. Obviously, this was his first fight as a free agent since his split from longtime promoter Oscar De La Hoya's Golden Boy Promotions. And he's still stuck with DAZN, which to some people was very surprising. But instead of working with Golden Boy, he actually works with the other DAZN partner in Matchroom USA, Matchroom Boxing, and Eddie Hearn. Where does Canelo go from here promoter-wise? I feel just based on the interviews that he gave after the fight, I think he's going to keep working with Eddie Hearn. I think he was impressed to keep him in the fold. What do you think, Curran?
Yeah, I think there's obviously no shortage of options for Canelo. So we've been talking about the PBC world because we mentioned some PBC fighters, Plant, Charlo, others. So there's obviously many opportunities there. But this is Canelo Alvarez, the #1 pound for pound fighter in the sport. There's no promoter that wouldn't want to work with him. Bob Arum has complimented Canelo in the past. Bob Arum doesn't say anything by accident. Sometimes he does, but for the most part, he doesn't. And so he complimented Canelo, obviously maybe planting that seed, hoping to work with him one day. I'm sure Top Rank and ESPN would be thrilled to work with him. If you look at Matchroom, I said a few months ago that I thought that made sense as a landing spot for Canelo. Early on when he signed the DAZN deal, Canelo said he liked that his fans could see his fights for $10. Now, obviously, we know the price has now gone up to $20, or it's less if you get it for a year. They tried a semi-type of pay-per-view model this time around. I believe it was $70, and you get 4 months of the DAZN. I think that's good that they're innovating and trying new things. I think that's a good thing. But overall, it sounded like he liked that overall concept. If he does, and he just can't work with Golden Boy because they had the situation, seems like Matchroom makes sense. He also reportedly after the fight went up to Eddie Hearn and said, "Hey, I knocked out a couple of your guys. Like, who do you got left?" And Eddie Hearn said, "We got a couple guys left. We got Saunders, Andre, we got Triple G." So there's really big fights still to be made there. Eddie Hearn obviously is working with a good amount of money. They can probably afford Canelo. So yeah, I mean, let's see what he does, but obviously the options are a lot for the pound for pound #1 fighter.
I just think it's funny that was it Bob Arum and some of the North American press, Eddie Hearn doesn't know how to promote boxing in the US. He's just done Anthony Joshua, Triple G, and Canelo in a week, and 2 of those fights were stateside.
That's true. Yeah, that's true.
And Matchroom has, if you look at the Matchroom USA roster, they have a lot of young up-and-coming fighters. I believe Ray Savage was on this card. Ammo Williams is another one. Diego Pacheco.
Castro just made his debut.
Castro made his debut as the undercard of a big fight, pay-per-view type fight. So there's also a lot of young fighters who are undefeated on that roster as well. Right.
Yeah. And I think obviously, Eddie Hearn already had some type of connection to the Canelo camp because he promotes Julio Cesar Martinez. So he's already had like some type of foundation in there with him, which I'm sure he utilized. But just based on Canelo's reaction, they asked him about his entrance. Obviously, he had the mariachi, do the final countdown, and then they go into his walkout song and stuff like that. And he seemed like he loved it. He was all about it. He was all about the theatrics and everything behind it. Because I think Eddie Hearn, and you guys, tell me if you guys disagree or agree with this. I think Eddie Hearn kind of looked at this too more as like a job interview. He's like, okay, I need to put on everything behind this guy so he can see, so he can stay with me, like do another fight. Maybe he'll work alongside with me. He co-promotes with him. It's Matchroom and Canelo Promotions. And then he puts on this, theater spectacle. I mean, what do you think, Curran?
Yeah, I mean, I'm all for the big spectacle. I love the big walkouts. Anthony Joshua's walkouts are great. It feels like you're setting up a big moment. I actually liked that they brought in Michael Buffer, even though it was virtual. I think that was cool. So I like the spectacle part of it. I like to make these events big, and no reason not to do that. When you have the top fighter in the sport, you have a big event. And you had fans in there. So it was a different feeling to hear those fans getting excited again. We haven't heard that in a while in the same way. So it was definitely a big event. And obviously Eddie Hearn, rolled out the red carpet as he should have.
What do you think, Mike?
Yeah, I agree. I know that Eddie Hearn in the UK kind of made boxing, when it kind of had its rebirth, he kind of made it into a night out. It wasn't just a sport. It was where, casuals would go to drink and party. And, obviously he plays music, has dramatic entrances, which he's brought that to the US. But yeah, I think he'd be foolish not to, try to, roll out the red carpet and give Canelo, whatever he wants. He can pick and choose wherever he goes. So if he's going to, make him feel at home, give him whatever he wants. And I'm sure, Matchroom and DAZN are giving him some, healthy paydays as well. So I'm sure that helps.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then before we move on to the Mohegan Sun Casino, Frank Sanchez, who's also associated with the Canelo camp, was also on this card here on DAZN. And he got the 7th round TKO over Julian Fernandez, which this fight actually ended up being, pretty entertaining to an extent, especially from Julian Fernandez. I think there was a lot of people who thought that Fernandez was just kind of going in there to be an opponent. But it seemed like Sanchez kind of struggled with him. Frank Sanchez obviously being 17-0 as rising in the heavyweight rankings. What do you guys think about him?
Yeah, I mean, if you're able to be undefeated at that level, you're going to get some attention. If you're able to get a knockout that way, you're going to get some attention. I think it's boxing. We talk about it all the time. It's what have you done for me lately? I think that applies to fights too. I mean, if you look at Wilder versus Luis Ortiz in the rematch, it seemed like he was just, lulling him to sleep, and then boom, landed the right hand and knocked him out. And that's probably what most people remember from that fight. So it's probably not how you start, but how you finish.
What do you think, Mike? What do you think about Frank Sanchez?
I was kind of surprised that he struggled with him. Frank Sanchez kind of has this kind of big reputation. I don't know whether it's because he comes out of the Canelo camp, and also that he's a Cuban, with some amateur pedigree. But he got the job done in the end. Kind of spectacular knockout, knocking him out the ring. So kind of like you said, you always remember the finish, and he did that in such a dramatic way that kind of you forget the beginning part of the fight. But it's kind of slowly but surely, where are they going to place him? And I kind of think it'd be kind of interesting to see him against, Luis Ortiz for the biggest and baddest Cuban heavyweight at some point down the line.
Yeah, you never know. That'd be an
Sign me up for that. Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Love it.
And moving on to the Mohegan Sun Casino in Connecticut. Jaron Boots Ennis remains undefeated. Actually, this was a no contest against Chris Van Herden. This was for the vacant IBO welterweight title. Technically, Jaron Ennis is still undefeated because it was no contest, so I stand by that statement. What do you guys think about this, this kind of a strange ordeal with this no contest thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously unfortunate whenever it happens, the cut from the accidental headbutt. Those are the rules. It goes down as a no decision, no contest. I think that doesn't hurt Boots in any way. That's it's on the record at the end. No big deal. Still undefeated, like you said, still has the very high knockout percentage. So it's unfortunate, but I think we just want to see him in there again.
Disappointing. And I thought it was a good matchup for Ennis. I thought he would, he'd win it. To me, I think he's the next rising star in that division. Just disappointing for, Chris Van Herden. He's kind of struggled to get fights, really. He was with Top Rank for a short period of time. It looked like they were trying to kind of match him up with Terence Crawford at some point down the line. He then got released or asked to be released by Top Rank. Came over to here, was kind of really cannon fodder, in my opinion, for Jaron Ennis. But it's just, he finally gets himself into the ring and, one round in, he gets the accidental headbutt and, it's all over. But hey, he got paid.
He definitely got paid. Yeah. And then moving on from Spain, as we mentioned, boxing is definitely global. I think all of our favorite model fighter, Sergio Martinez, returns again for his second fight in his what would you call it, comeback tour, I guess. And gets the 9th round TKO over Juzi Koivula. Is that how you say it, Mike?
Yeah, that's how I would have said it. Yeah.
Sergio Martinez was on our show just before he made his comeback, Curran, and he was definitely serious. And he definitely seems like he wants maybe like a Chavez Jr. rematch, maybe just more for like one last, big event or get some attention behind it. Kind of standing back and watching his two comeback fights now. What do you think is the ultimate plan for him? Do you agree it's probably the Chavez Jr., try to get him?
Big fan of Sergio Martinez. Obviously, my time at HBO, we got to cover a lot of his huge fights, his homecoming fight in Argentina, even though he maybe lost that fight, went down, but still got the decision there. It was in the rain. It was just an event to be there. So many big Sergio Martinez's fights, and on the way up, it was just something really special to watch. I was there live for the rematch against Paul Williams, where he knocked him out in the second round, one of the best knockouts of all time, by far. And it was great to watch his rise. I always loved Sergio Martinez's style. I feel like he took regular boxing and just kind of flipped it on its head. Your fighters are taught to move forward. He moved backward. You didn't know which way he was going or how far back he was going. Fighters are taught to keep your hands up. He fought with his hands down. Setting up, he was a southpaw, setting up that big overhand left. So he really thought about the game in a totally different way. It's almost like he took regular boxing and just flipped it on its head. And if you look at some of the stuff he did for training, balance was a big part of it. He used to go paddle boarding. He would do other things because his style was just so different. And I think he just lit up the boxing world. So that was who he was. The last time we saw him in a competitive big fight was Miguel Cotto. That was in 2014 at the Garden. Obviously the knees and the legs were not there, and he ended up losing that fight, knocked down 3 times in the first round. Now he's making the comeback, as you mentioned. I was lucky enough to interview him as well. I was lucky enough to interview 2 legends. I had him and I had Jerry Olaya to interpret. So that was great. That was a thrill for me. He said in that interview, and I'm sure he said it with you, he wants the Chavez Jr. fight. When I asked him why, he said, you would think, it's because he beat him, but then everyone remembers that last round where he got knocked down. It looked like he was almost out. Credit to him for staying on his feet, Sergio, but he did. So he probably feels like maybe there's a little bit of unfinished business. That's not what he told me, and I'm guessing it's not what he told you either, which was that he feels like he's coming back now at 45 years old because he's looking at this like a challenge, right? He's someone who likes to challenge himself. That mentality is probably what got him to where he was in the boxing world. And he still has that. And his point was with Chavez, he felt like Chavez is in a low place as well. Obviously, we've seen Chavez has not lived up at all to his father. That's what we thought maybe, early on in the career, getting all the knockouts. We thought maybe that, that's the path he was trying to go to. Obviously, that hasn't happened. The dedication isn't there. The work ethic isn't there. I spoke to Chavez Sr. He said, I still run 5 a.m. in the morning. He said, my son doesn't necessarily do that. So you can kind of see that obviously in what's happened in his career recently. So Sergio's point was that I want to bring Chavez Jr. up as well with me. And I want to do this together, almost like as an opportunity for both of them. So will it happen? I mean, I think we just saw Mike Tyson fight Roy Jones. So anything's possible. And will it happen? Probably. I mean, it's boxing, so why not?
What do you think, Mike?
I think it's good because, Sergio Martinez hasn't come back for the money. When everyone says, he's a successful businessman, he's successful outside of boxing, he doesn't need to come back for the money, which is always something that you kind of go to straight away when you hear about somebody coming back. You're like, here we go. He's blown all of his cash and it's the only way he's going to get paid. So, in a way that he's come back for the right reasons. And if the opponents are selected, in a good way that he's fighting people around his own age. And I don't mind it. I just don't want him getting in there with some young, hungry lions and then just getting demolished, because we all remember, those good days of watching, Sergio Martinez, because he's done everything the hard way. He did come into boxing and, with a matchroom or a top rank and get given, selected opponents to make him look good. he came in, with a very awkward style, like, Curran said, and, won over our hearts. And then that's why we all love him, It's he's just got one hell of a story.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we'll see. But I wouldn't be surprised if that Chavez Jr. Fight happens, especially in 2021. So it's very likely that it'll happen just based on where they're at in their careers. Fight previews this upcoming Saturday, the 26th of December, the day after Christmas, from the Shrine Exposition Center in Los Angeles on Fox Sports 1. David Morrell goes up against Mike Gavronski. I hope I said that right. I apologize if I didn't. This is for the vacant WBA super middleweight title. I don't know if this is a typo or not, but is David Morrell, Mike, is he really 3-0?
Yeah, it's just obviously one of those Cubans that comes in with a great pedigree, kind of going after that Lomachenko style where the guys are now, he's 3-0. He could be 4-0 and a world champion. So they're really, really pushing him. He's not really had, an easy start to his pro career, but he's kind of somebody that people are pushing. The boxing hardcore fans all know who he is, and he's kind of making some ripples really in the pool so far.
Curran, what do you think about that aspect in terms of when you have a very heavy amateur pedigree, like a Lomachenko, for example, which is a pretty good example to use, and you turn pro, and within your first 5 fights, you get a world title shot, or you start fighting some of the best names, some of the top 5-10 guys in your weight class because of your amateur pedigree. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. If you have that huge amateur pedigree, the way Lomachenko did, and then you get that opportunity. Obviously, he had the Salido fight in his second fight. Salido kind of roughed him up, used different type of tactics. He ended up getting a loss on his record. Didn't necessarily stop him from becoming close to the pound for pound one. He was kind of 1-1A with Crawford for a long time. A lot of people had him 1. Right. So it didn't necessarily hurt him. So not, you could say that, why not throw him in there if they've earned that in terms of the amateur background they bring to the table. I'm looking at his box rec right now, unless it says he's 22 years old. So still very young versus I believe when Lomachenko turned pro, because I think he competed in 2 or 3 Olympics. So therefore he was older in age. So that was a different situation. So maybe he needed to be fast tracked. If you're 22 years old, maybe you don't necessarily need to be fast tracked. But it'll be interesting to see. I mean, that's obviously a promoter's job about how they're going to market someone, how they're going to build someone up. It's probably better than the alternative, which we see a lot of times, which is, people end up getting to be 20-0, fighting not the best opposition. That's not what we want to see. We want to see competitive matchups. That's, we were talking about Ring City earlier. I think that's the whole mantra, is just anyone, anywhere, anytime. It's all about the competitive fights. It's bringing in competitive matchups no matter who you are. And I think that's what we want to see as boxing fans. I believe on the undercard, unless it's changed, I think James Kirkland is on that undercard.
He is.
I'm interested to see him. I spent some time in his camp when he was training for the Canelo Alvarez fight. And he was, at the time, he was not with Ann Wolf. Didn't surprise me that he got the loss. He's kind of done his comeback, if you will. He fought twice in 2019. At the end of the day, he only has 2 losses. Obviously, the shocking loss to Ishida, and then the fight with Canelo. So maybe he's trying to do a comeback for himself. 36 years old. We know what he's been through. Spent time in jail. So that'll also be interesting to check out as well.
Yeah, what James Kirkland is, it's definitely the year or the 2 years of the comeback for a lot of fighters in the sport of boxing. And then for James Kirkland, I was always kind of disappointed that we never got to see his fight against Miguel Cotto, because I always thought that was kind of intriguing. And then, I forgot why it didn't come to fruition, but I remember watching the press conference for that fight and everything. I mean, I don't know, Curran, if you were a part of that whole event in any aspect, but I was always disappointed that we never got to see that fight.
Yeah, absolutely. There was so many fights along the way that we were rumored were coming together, and then they fall apart. I do remember that fight coming together. I believe it was going to be in Dallas, Kirkland versus Cotto. It would have been interesting for sure. And like we said, Kirkland is just an interesting fighter based on the ups and downs in his career. A lot of downs, obviously. So that would have been intriguing to see. He's still a name that people know, and so he can be used as a measuring stick against a lot of other fighters. And I'm sure that that's probably, what's going to happen. We're going to see him against fighters maybe on the way up. And then it'll be a decision of if he's got it, if he's still a competitive fighter, or if he kind of goes into the more of the gatekeeper type of status.
What do you think, Mike?
It's just what you don't know what he's come back for. Like we just touched on then, is he coming back just for the money? Is he coming back just because, he's fit and healthy and he's still, he's still got that competition. He's still got that drive. Because, so far he's had a couple of easy knockovers, just trying to get back, get rid of that ring rust. But, we'll kind of see once he steps up in class. But, he was a fan favorite back in the day. So.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I was just going to add, I mean, there's also absolutely nothing wrong with, coming back from money if that's the case, because for boxers, a lot of times it can be their livelihood. I mentioned briefly earlier, Sonny Duverson, who was on the main event against Brandon Adams. I was talking to him about his story. He spent some time in jail and he was telling me his story. It was a couple of nights before the fight, and he was a manager at a fast food chain. And he had gone to jail. Now he was out. He was doing everything the right way. Manager at a fast food chain. Obviously, like anyone else in corporate America, he wanted to work his way up. And they said, based on your background of being in jail, you cannot be a general manager. And in his mind, he was like, well, what am I supposed to do? I'm trying to do this the right way. I'm trying to earn a living. And that's when he said, well, you know what? I got to go into boxing because that's the one thing that I'm allowed to do here in this case. Now that was a specific case there, but everyone has their own situation, own scenario. So if boxing is your way of getting your livelihood, then that's what you have to do, that's what you have to do. As long as, obviously fighter safety is also very important, and we don't want to see people hurt in the same way at the same time. Absolutely.
And as we as we turn the corner towards the finish line of this episode of The Last Round for the news and notes section, what's your take on, I believe it's DAZN's next significant event between Ryan Garcia and arguably his toughest test to date, and the Olympic medalist in Luke Cambell? What's your take on that, Curran?
Yeah, very, very excited for this fight, starting off the new year with a bang for sure. Ryan Garcia, he's undefeated, 20-0. People maybe don't give him credit because they see followers on Instagram and things like that. My feeling on that is you could have a lot of followers on Instagram and also be a really good fighter. I also think fighters marketing themselves is a good thing. I think that's a great thing, making yourself accessible, putting yourself out there, engaging with fans. I think that's a really good thing to do. And so I'm definitely really looking forward to that fight. I mean, he's 22 years old. Credit to him for taking a test like Luke Cambell. And I'm definitely excited for that fight. And it's just the same thing that we've been talking about this entire episode. We're going to learn a lot about who Ryan Garcia is.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. It's definitely one of the most intriguing matchups in a long time, at least from my memory, just because, like you mentioned, Ryan Garcia has millions and millions of social media followers. So at this point, people look at him like his popularity from a social media perspective at this point might be higher than his talent in the ring. But we know he has talent, obviously, to make it to this level. But people want to see, okay, does it match up to the hype that he has on social media and this following? Mike doesn't think so, but I think it's intriguing regardless. I mean, why don't you think so, Mike? Go ahead and take the floor one more time.
I always describe him as he's a lightweight Deontay Wilder. He looks like he's gone to Eddie Reynoso and all the videos that he puts on, Instagram and Twitter and stuff like that. He's still making those same mistakes. He's still, as soon as he throws like a hook, his hand drops. He's, backing out with his chin still in the air. Those fundamental mistakes that he's constantly been making. And, like everybody else in the world, he's been matched very well. He brings people up from the weight category below, beats those guys. But those guys, it doesn't really seem like they've come to win. He's got knockout power. He's got very good reflexes, very good timing. But you've never seen anybody really put him on the back foot. And from what I've seen so far, and, been ringside when he fought a few people like Carlos Morales, when Carlos Morales jabbed him, and Ryan Garcia, closed his eyes and was kind of like, oh my God, like what happened there? He's like he'd never been punched in the face. You hear a lot of stories from the gym wars of, as soon as he starts losing, he kind of like makes an excuse to get out the ring and, goes, that's him, he's done, home he goes. So I think when he comes up against somebody that's actually going to put him on him and put it, see if he has a back foot game, I don't think he will. He just seems like one of those guys that, you know, when something goes wrong in training, he'll just make an excuse, and he's not going to work on, those parts of the game that need polishing. Like, he always just uses that same bag, does the videos on that same bag, and because he's good at that, he does that, and he does that all the time. Whereas someone like Canelo, I can see him being completely the opposite, because he's, for legacy, and he's a skillful fighter that he'll work on elements of his game that he's not very good at, where Ryan won't.
Well, that's what makes it such an intriguing fight, right? Because this is the moment that we learn, is this guy for real or not? And in terms of what you said, I mean, for me, it's, if you look at this kid's 22 years old, Ryan Garcia, 20-0, 17 knockouts. Like I was saying before, at the end of the day, there were still other people across the ring from him. I know what, in your opinion, you're saying that maybe they weren't necessarily there to win, but they probably didn't want to get knocked out, probably didn't want to lose the way they did. In terms of what he's doing on Instagram and things like that, I've always been of the belief that fighters engaging with their fans and creating content is a good thing. There's a lot of work that comes with that as well. Nothing wrong with marketing yourself. That helps you get opportunities. He has this opportunity, and it's doesn't matter your opinion of him. If you like him, if you don't, that's why it's such a good fight, because we're going to learn so much on January 2nd.
I'm going to look stupid if you knock Cambell out.
You are. You definitely are. I'm going to be the first one to tell you. Curran, you mentioned like fighters marketing themselves in terms of Ryan Garcia. I think, as boxing fans, obviously everybody has their favorite fighters. They're like, oh, I like this guy. I prefer his style. I like his pedigree. I like his resume. I like his knockout power, whatever. But I think, we could all agree that ultimately we're all fans as a whole of the sport. We like boxing. We like the sport. And regardless of what people may think of Ryan Garcia, what his antics on social media are, or his videos, or, his in-ring mistakes, kind of keeping his chin up, or getting jabbed by Carlos Morales in Indio, California, over there at the Fantasy Springs Casino, or anything like that, I don't think it's wrong to say that if he wins, it's only going to get more eyeballs to the sport, and obviously his audience is a younger crowd. So it's a new generation of fans that he's bringing in. And if he keeps winning, then the sport of boxing gets more mainstream because he is getting mainstream attention. What do you think, Curran?
Yeah, no, 100%. I think the best way that I could look at it is, we're talking about the fundamentals not being totally right. That is, so it's almost like if you look at Anthony Joshua, we know there's vulnerabilities there, right? We've seen him rocked. We've seen him knocked out. That to me makes fighters inherently more interesting. It was like when you watched Amir Khan in his prime, such a skilled boxer, such great hand speed. Sometimes he would get knocked down, knocked out, right? So it was almost like watching a man on a tightrope, and it makes it that much more compelling as a viewer. So I like fighters that have vulnerabilities. I like when fighters, maybe it's not completely there in terms of the fundamentals and things like that. I'm not saying that's the case here, but I'm just saying and speaking in a general sense in that way. So I think that's interesting. I think we should try to get viewers' eyeballs in any way that we can. If it's a younger crowd, great, because then obviously, hopefully they can grow up with the sport and continue to be fans. I think if you're bringing in eyeballs from other places, like YouTubers or people that have grown their own audience, whatever it is, I think more eyeballs is better than less eyeballs. But the one thing I would say is that if you're going to bring in the eyeballs, you want to deliver on that event, right? You don't want people to show up and say, watch boxing, and then something, some terrible decision happens, or some really non-competitive bad fight happens, or whatever the case may be. And then sports fans will say, oh, well, that's why I don't like boxing, right? We don't want that to happen. But we do want more people to be obviously funneled into the sport, because it is such a great sport.
I do wonder, the crossover from Instagram to, people watching on TV and people being in attendance, because I always go back to, like Ryan Garcia has 7.7 million fans on Instagram. He didn't sell out the Honda Center.
That's true. I don't think it's been proven that it's technically translated yet. What do you think, Curran?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it would depend on what it means for viewership. I'm not necessarily sure about in-person viewing. It depends on how many people are watching this content, searching for this person, watching the highlights. Then you could get into the argument of YouTubers and if they should be fighting or not. I think it depends. It's case by case. I do think the one thing I would say is that there's a lot of work to create a following in that way. Even being a YouTuber is a lot of work to create a channel and post content and create a following. And I believe that when KSI and Logan Paul did fight the rematch on the Zone. I believe the YouTube highlights of that were in the tens of millions. So people were at least tuning in for the highlights. To your point about how many people are going to, watch this guy on Instagram, but then live in that area and get in a car and go to the Honda Center. I don't know if that translates necessarily. But that doesn't mean that, they may not be fans of the sport, and that some of them may hopefully continue to be fans of the sport because they see another fighter on the undercard, or they learn more about the sport by watching it, or when they search highlights for their fighter that they know from Instagram or YouTube, then the next video that auto plays is another fighter that maybe is a top pound for pound fighter or an exciting fighter. And then they start to watch that person. I don't think there's anything wrong with that path. And so hopefully that happens. Like I said, the one thing we don't want is you get the new audience and then you disappoint them with a poor product, and then they don't come back again. That's the one thing we want to avoid.
Because one thing I always go to is when they always talk about that, and then they say, he was in his backyard, he was in California, but Ricky Hatton sold out Las Vegas, and they had to fly here. So that's one thing I always compare it to is they always say about how big he is and stuff like that, and I'm sure he's got more fans than Ricky Hatton has, social media wise, and obviously it was years and years ago, but all the British fans had to fly over here and pay thousands of dollars to come and see Ricky Hatton, and
you could tell how he really feels, Curran.
No, I think it's a great argument. I think it's a great discussion. I mean, yeah, it's possible. It's definitely makes a lot of sense. You're saying the fans don't necessarily translate to boxing fans. Like I said, it just depends on it just depends on if those fans come to the actual event or they watch the fight or they look for highlights. However, they're consuming that, right? But I don't think there's anything wrong with him necessarily having fans. If they translate to coming into the arena, I don't know. I also think Ricky Hatton, I'm guessing in the cases that you're talking about, that was either fighting Manny Pacquiao or Floyd Mayweather, which were obviously bigger and more intriguing matchups and fights. Ricky Hatton, when he first came over here, he was undefeated. He brought over his huge supportive fans. I was there for some of those fights. It was great to see all of those fans travel and watch him there. So yeah, I think it depends a little bit. And I think we don't know exactly yet, but I don't think having a following is a bad thing is my overall point. I don't know how it translates to going to the arena, but I think if there's a chance that you could convert some of those people, I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think, as we tie a bow on that subject, I don't think it's never a bad thing for the fighter to self-market themselves. Even if there hasn't been any tangible evidence that the social media following hasn't translated to buys or subscriptions or viewership. It's still good to have that type of audience on that social platform regardless. I don't think any promoter or platform or network would say, oh no, we don't want that there. I think it's good to have it there regardless, because eventually that could translate at a later point down the road. Before we let you go here, Curran, we wanted to get your one last take on Vasily Lomachenko came out and accused the judges of in the fight against in his bout against Teofimo Lopez of being bribed, which was very surprising to many fans and media personalities, pundits. What was your initial reaction when you heard about that?
It really goes back to what we were talking about earlier. And so we were talking about Deontay Wilder and how he handled his first loss. And what I said, any fighter that gets their first loss, it's how they handle it. Now, I know that this was not Vasily Lomachenko's first loss. We talked about how he lost to Salido in his second pro fight, but between now and then, there was a lot that happened. And Lomachenko just obviously rose through the ranks, top pound for pound fighter. So this was the first monumental loss when he was Vasily Lomachenko, right? When he was that guy, established guy. And he just got outclassed by Teofimo Lopez, who did his thing. Lomachenko started too late, couldn't catch up. Lopez definitely won that fight. As long as boxing's been going on, there's always people who think it's corrupt. There's always people who say the fix is in, things like that. There was a time, back in the day with the mob and things like that, when the fix probably was in. If it's happening now, we see bad scorecards all the time, and we say, how could that possibly be? How could someone look at this fight and say that? That's not the case, obviously, with Lopez versus Lomachenko. The closest you could possibly even have it was a draw, which I believe that's what Andre Ward's scorecard had, because you had Lomachenko coming on, and that's giving him all of the close rounds, right? So. Right. Do I think it was rigged? No. I think the reason he's saying that is because what we've been talking about, the way fighters react after their first big loss or that first monumental loss. It's interesting how they go through that. And I think that's the mentality and the mindset that you have to have as a fighter, because you are so confident in your abilities. You are so, I was listening to Chris Algieri on the mic the other day for the Triple G fight. And he was saying when he was getting ready to fight Manny Pacquiao in China, obviously Manny Pacquiao was the legend, and Chris Algieri, even though he had beat Provannikov, he wasn't on the same level at all. But Chris Algieri said even in that moment, he had to have that delusional self-confidence, right? He said it bordered on delusional. That's what you need to be a fighter. So if you're bordering on delusional when you're fighting people, then you lose. Some of that delusion may trickle in. We've seen that, unfortunately, with Deontay Wilder, who put out a couple of theories of what happened, split up with one of his trainers. And now with Lomachenko saying what he's saying, I think the best way to make up for it is try to campaign for a rematch, get back in there, or continue your career and fight other people and prove that wasn't what should have happened. So I think that's my take on it. I think it's because it was such a monumental loss for him.
Right. Yeah, it was definitely different, especially like you mentioned, his first loss against Salido. At that point, he wasn't Vasily Lomachenko, but at this point against Teofimo Lopez, he was the Vasily Lomachenko. They're like two different people in a sense. So yeah, there's definitely a difference there. That's a really good analogy. But obviously we appreciate your time, Curran. We know you're on the East Coast, but before, I think Mike has one last thing for you before we let you go here.
Like we've been asking all the guests since it's towards the end of the year, Curran, if we could just get your fighter of the year, knockout of the year, and then lastly, your fight of the year.
Yeah, absolutely. And this has been great. Thank you guys so much. So fighter of the year, it's obviously it's different year, right? It's been so different based on what happened. We had the global pandemic. It disrupted the sport. It's changed a lot of things. It's changed how much fighters can fight. So in the past, maybe you'd want to get a fighter of the year who fought 2 or 3 times, probably 2, who did something great both times. I think this year is different just based on everything that happened. For me, it's Teofimo Lopez, what he did at his age to definitively win against Lomachenko, who was 1 or 1A, like we said, in the pound for pound rankings and almost everyone's pound for pound rankings at the time, and kind of back up all the talk that he had. I spent some time with Lopez, and it's always, he's a great guy to be around, and he's always very talkative, and he backed it up. So I think that's in there. I also would say my honorable mention would be Errol Spence coming back from the car accident. He went through the horrific car accident towards the end of 2019, as we know. He didn't know if he was going to walk again, let alone fight again. He used it as motivation to be the best version of Errol Spence. He trained harder than I think he's trained before. He looked more ripped. I had worked on one of the preview countdown shows, and it was featured on that. You could see that this was, one of the best versions of Errol Spence, because he really, didn't take anything for granted. So that would be my fighter of the year.
What about fight of the year?
So fight of the year for me, so obviously a lot of people are talking about Zepeda, Baranchyk, and other fights. I'm going to look at it a little differently. And I'm going to say not necessarily by competitiveness, but what it meant. And that to me is Fury Wilder 2, the meaning of what that meant for the heavyweight division. Tyson Fury having the close first fight, which was a draw, literally got up, within a tenth of a second or whatever it was in the first fight, and came back with a totally different game plan, bulked up to 273 pounds, said, I'm going to go at this guy and knock this guy out. And I think he gets all the credit in the world for doing that. It was 2 undefeated fighters. It was 2 champions. And the fact that Fury, usually you say in rematches that the counterpuncher has the advantage because they learn more about the fighter versus the brawler. Well, in this case, it was more of like, well, Wilder can box, but he's got the right hand. Fury, I guess you could say, is more of the boxer moving around. But he didn't choose that boxing route. He chose the come at you route and dominated this guy and knocked him out. So just based on everything that fight meant, and now hopefully in 2021 we get Fury versus Joshua. It sounds like they're talking, and hopefully that will give us the unification fight plus the lineal championship. That's never happened before in the heavyweight division, all 4 belts plus the lineal championship. That would be amazing to see. And then KO of the year. It's obvious, right, guys? We were talking about YouTubers. It's Jake Paul over Nate. No. I'm just
I was
kidding.
hoping you would say that.
Just kidding. Just wanted to.
We're gonna cut that piece and just post it everywhere.
Wanted to see your reaction. Yeah, don't take me out of context on that one, please. So there's a couple KOs of the year for me. A lot of people talk about Povetkin White. That was a good one. I have one that was a little bit less well known. So again, it wasn't for the significance, but just a beautiful KO. Fabio Wardley in his last fight versus Richard Lartey. Just a beautiful, beautiful left hook. And then you probably call it a right hand, but it wasn't really a straight right hand. It was almost closer to a looping punch, like a right hook. So almost like 2 hooks in a row. His opponent just folded like a lawn chair. That was on the undercard of a Conor Benn fight. It was just absolutely beautiful. So I really enjoyed that. When I watched that, I was just like, oh my God, what did I just see? Luckily his opponent was okay. But I've interviewed Fabio Wardley. He's definitely going to do some big things. 25 years old and the heavyweight division. And of course, right there, 1 and 1A is Tank Davis. That does bring in the significance of what that fight was. It was 48-47 on all the scorecards at the time. So it was a relatively close fight. And then leaving no doubt the uppercut from another dimension, Tank Davis knocking out Leo Santa Cruz. I mean, that was beautiful. Especially someone like Santa Cruz, who only had 1 loss up to that point. It's not like this is someone with a shaky chin who's easy to knock out. Very, very impressive. So those would be my KOs of the year.
Definitely solid picks in every single one of those categories. And once again, Curran, Bhatia, we definitely appreciate your time. We know you're on the East Coast. We're over here in California time, so you're a couple hours ahead of us. But before we let you go ahead and plug. Obviously, you got Ring City, you got your own podcast. Go ahead and plug everything you got upcoming.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely catch me on Ring City USA on NBC Sports, and the undercards are on Twitch, and you can watch it globally on Twitch as well. And I want to definitely thank the whole Ring City team. It's been a dream come true for me to work with them. I want to thank all of the great people at NBC Sports. It's been a dream come true for me to tell these stories. Getting to go meet these fighters and tell their stories, and then also be on air, commentate on these fights. Absolute dream come true for me. So I want to thank them all for that, and definitely catch me on that. We're going to have a lot of events at Ring City USA in 2021. Very excited about that series. They're doing boxing the right way. I'm not just saying it because I'm a part of it. They want competitive matchups. You're going to see competitive matchups, anyone, anywhere, anytime. That's the motto. That's what they've done so far, and they're going to continue to do that. We're going to continue to do that and tell these stories in 2021. Definitely very exciting. If you want to follow me on my personal channels, you can follow at Curran Bhatia, at CurranBhatia on Instagram, Twitter. You can subscribe to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Curran Bhatia. And then my podcast is called Ask the Experts. You can find it anywhere you listen to podcasts. Find it on YouTube, and you can follow Ask the Experts podcast on Instagram and Twitter, ATE_podcast on Instagram and Twitter. But the best way to connect with me, like I said, Instagram and Twitter, my personal channels at Curran Bhatia. Please, hit me up anytime you want to chat about boxing, anything you want to talk about, hit me up. I love engaging with fans. I love talking boxing, talking production, everything. And I want to thank you guys so much for having me on. I really enjoyed talking with you. It's a great format you have here, very long form, going through, getting into the nitty gritty. I love it. And thank you so much. And I'd love to be on again in the new year. We can talk about what actually happened in this Ryan Garcia fight. And then one of us will probably have to eat some crows. So it'd be great to keep the conversation going in the new year.
You definitely won't be on if Ryan Garcia wins. I won't be on.
You won't be on. You definitely won't be on. Before we sign off here, Mike, go ahead and let our listeners know where they can find us and follow us.
So we're at The Last Round 12 on Instagram and Twitter, and obviously catch us next week. We'll be doing the end of year show and also, previewing the fight we've just been talking about, the Ryan Garcia-Luke Cambell fight.
We also got some new merch. We haven't mentioned it yet, at least on an episode. We got some new shirts and a new sweater. We've partnered up with Fit Warrior, so you can go on their website. We have some of their links on our Twitter and Instagram account. We have some pictures of the merchandise on there. So if you can support us, we'd appreciate it. Go ahead, Mike.
And I forgot to mention, we'll also be on Monday. Will be a new competition coming out. We've teamed up with Hamilton Cab Publications, so we'll be doing a competition to win one of their books. If you just guess the winner of the Ryan Garcia-Luke Cambell fight, and you'll be able to find that on Twitter and Instagram.
Absolutely. For once again, our big thanks to Curran Bhatia of Ring City USA and Ask the Experts podcast. For my co-host Michael Shepard, I'm Danny Z. This is The Last Round.
Thanks for supporting and listening to the show. Follow us at The Last Round 12 on social media. Rate, review, and subscribe. This is The Last Round Podcast.